You're staring at a skull, cracked and scarred, dug from the depths of a cave where silence has lasted nearly 1,000,000 years. It belongs to a child, no older than 7, but the real horror lies not in the age of the bones. It's in the marks etched across them. Perfect, deliberate cuts, the kind that could only be carved by sharpened stone. These wounds are not the work of wild beasts, nor the scars of time. They are the fingerprints of human hands. Hands that once gripped blades not to defend, but to feast. For centuries, we've told ourselves that our ancestors' greatest enemies were lions, snakes, or saber-toothed cats lurking in the dark. But the bones whisper a far more disturbing truth. The deadliest predator stalking humans was often another human. Across caves in Spain, Germany, Belgium, and even England, archaeologists have unearthed fragments of a story so unsettling that many tried to deny it at first. Children butchered with the same precision as deer, skulls transformed into cups, bones repurposed into weapons, a hidden thread of cannibalism woven into our evolutionary past. And if you think this was desperation, survival in the harshest of winters, think again. The evidence tells us something far colder. This wasn't necessity, this was choice. And the deeper we dig, the darker the story becomes. Stay with me, because the truth I'm about to reveal will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about human nature. Deep inside the Atapuerca mountains of northern Spain lies a cavern that archaeologists call Gran Dolina, a place where time itself seems to drip down the limestone walls, layer by layer, until you touch an age when the world was unrecognizable and yet disturbingly familiar. In 1994, a team of excavators brushed away soil from what they thought was another routine stratum of animal bones and stone tools, the typical traces of early human occupation. But what they uncovered instead was something that made even hardened researchers freeze in silence. A fragment of skull, unmistakably human, and not from a grown warrior or elder, but a child, 6, maybe 7 years old. At first, it might have been dismissed as an isolated burial, a solemn token of prehistoric grief. But the bone bore scratches, a chilling series of parallel incisions that were too neat, too precise to be natural. These were not the marks of weathering, nor the bite of scavengers. They were the unmistakable signatures of stone blades slicing through flesh. And as more fragments were unearthed, a jaw here, a femur cracked for marrow there, ribs, vertebrae, tiny finger bones, the picture grew clearer and darker. By the time the dust settled, at least 11 individuals had been identified, most of them children and young adolescents, their remains carrying the same cut marks seen on deer and horses in the very same layer. This was no accident. Someone had killed and eaten them. But who? The answer turned the horror inward. It was other humans. Homo, antecessor, an early cousin of ours who not only hunted the beasts of the plains, but sometimes each other as well. What made this discovery even more disturbing was the methodical efficiency of the butchery. Long bones split systematically to suck out marrow, skulls fractured at calculated points to access the brain, flesh removed in the same places where professional butchers today would cut for maximum yield. This was not random savagery nor some clumsy act of desperation. It was skill, repeated skill, learned and passed down like any other technique of survival. And here's where the story takes a twist that will keep you uneasy. The victims were not the elderly, not the sick, not even infants who would have been defenseless. They were children old enough to walk, to think, to perhaps cry out when seized. And yet, they were targeted, consumed, erased. Why target children? The scientists wrestled with this question for years, offering explanations that tried to soften the horror. Maybe this was ritualistic, some mortuary practice where bodies were defleshed as part of belief. Maybe bones had been jumbled accidentally with animal remains. But every line of evidence shattered those comforting illusions. The marks weren't symbolic or ceremonial. They were placed exactly where one would cut to strip muscle. The breaks weren't random fractures. They were the telltale cracks of marrow extraction, and the selection of age was too specific to be chance. Some researchers began to whisper an even colder hypothesis, that this was strategic. By eliminating the children of rival groups, you didn't just gain food, you weakened your enemy's future. You removed tomorrow's hunters before they grew strong enough to fight. It was not just cannibalism, it was a form of prehistoric warfare. Stay with me, because this isn't a single horrific incident frozen in time. Gran Dolina revealed not just one layer of butchered human bones, but multiple layers, separated by thousands of years, each containing the same chilling signs. Again and again, generation after generation, this practice returned like a shadow that refused to vanish. And if you think this horror belonged only to a primitive, distant species, brace yourself, because the deeper archaeologists dug into the timeline of humanity, the more they realized this wasn't an isolated cultural anomaly. Cannibalism, practiced not from desperation but from choice, kept reappearing like a dark echo across our family tree, from Homo heidelbergensis in Germany to Neanderthals in Belgium, and even to our own species in the caves of England. But before we step forward into those later shadows, hold on to the image of those children at Gran Dolina, because their bones whisper something profound about what it means to be human. They remind us that the same hands that could craft delicate stone tools, that could nurture fire and shape shelters, could also crack open a child's skull without hesitation. That contradiction of intelligence and brutality intertwined will only grow sharper the further we walk down this path. And trust me, the discoveries waiting in the next caves will make Gran Dolina feel almost tame by comparison. Step back now, away from the narrow confines of Gran Dolina, and picture a landscape alive with thunderous herds of wild horses, where rivers carve through green valleys and fires burn in the hearths of shelters that have long since turned to ash. It is here, around 400,000 years ago, that another branch of humanity thrived. Homo heidelbergensis, a species that stood tall, broad-shouldered, with brains as large as ours, sometimes larger, and a mastery of tools that would forever change the balance between predator and prey. For centuries, museums painted them as stoop-shouldered brutes, but the evidence pulled from the ground tells another story. One of intelligence, craftsmanship, and organization, qualities that could be turned toward survival or toward something far more sinister. Archaeologists uncovered their tools, hand axes so perfectly shaped, so balanced and symmetrical that they seemed to blend utility with artistry, as though their makers cared about more than cutting meat or scraping hides. But what truly sends a chill down the spine are the wooden spears found at Schöningen in Germany, buried deep within an ancient coal mine. These were not crude branches sharpened at one end. They were engineered weapons, 7 feet long, carved with such precision that modern javelin throwers testing replicas found they could fly straight and true for over 70 feet. In the same layers lay the butchered remains of horses, dozens of them, bones scarred by stone tools in patterns unmistakably familiar, skin stripped, joints dismembered, marrow cracked open. But think about what that means. Horses are fast, powerful animals, not prey that can be stumbled upon and picked off. To bring them down required coordination, planning, communication. It required humans working together as a unit, anticipating movement, striking with projectiles at range before the hooves could crush them. This was organized hunting, evidence that our ancestors were learning to act not as scavengers, but as predators in their own right. And here lies the terrifying truth. Skills honed against wild animals are just as effective when turned against other humans. The same spears that could pierce the flank of a horse could just as easily be aimed at the chest of a rival. The same tactical coordination that funneled herds into kill zones could funnel enemy families into ambushes. The hearths discovered at Terra Amata in France, shelters large enough to house groups with controlled fires at their center, show us that these people were not drifters. They made homes, they lingered, they established bases, they had permanence, and permanence meant territory, and territory meant conflict. What happens when another group settles too close? What happens when resources overlap? What happens when one band of Homo heidelbergensis looks across the valley and sees not neighbors, but competitors? The bones at Gran Dolina whisper an answer, and the weapons at Schöningen shout it. Humans had learned to hunt, and humans could be hunted. Some scientists suggest that the precision of those spears, the cooperation required to wield them effectively, might have given rise to a new kind of predator-prey relationship, one in which the prey could look disturbingly familiar. And while direct evidence of heidelbergensis on heidelbergensis violence remains scarce compared to the later Neanderthal caves, the very existence of such lethal technology suggests the possibility was always lurking, always one step away. Stay with me, because soon we'll see how those possibilities erupted into undeniable reality. How Neanderthals, our closest genetic kin, left behind bones bearing not only the marks of consumption, but the cold efficiency of practicality. Bones repurposed into tools, as if the line between human and animal had simply dissolved. But before we get there, keep this in mind. The same intelligence that allowed our ancestors to craft weapons of astonishing sophistication also allowed them to look at other humans not as kin, not even as rivals, but as resources, as calories, as tools. And that double edge, the brilliance of invention and the brutality of its application, cuts through the very core of our shared history. Now the path leads us into a darker cavern, one echoing not with the voices of Homo, antecessor, or Heidelbergensis, but with the deep, guttural echoes of our closest kin, the Neanderthals. For a long time, we imagined them as lumbering cousins, brutish survivors of the Ice Age who eventually faded into extinction. But the bones they left behind in Goyet Cave, Belgium, tell a story far more disturbing than their simple disappearance. Here, among layers of reindeer bones carefully butchered and discarded, archaeologists uncovered fragments of Neanderthals. 5 individuals in total, their remains treated with the same cold efficiency as the animals lying beside them. 100 fragments of human bone, etched with cut marks, split for marrow, skulls cracked open with deliberate force. These were not burials, these were meals. But the Neanderthals went further. After carving the flesh and sucking the marrow dry, they didn't discard the bones, they repurposed them. A femur became a hammer to shape stone blades. A tibia served as a retoucher to sharpen cutting edges. Tools forged from the bodies of those who, only hours or days before, had spoken, hunted, lived. Stop for a moment and consider the psychology of that act. It wasn't simply about survival. It wasn't even just about calories. It was about utility, about reducing a fellow human to raw material, interchangeable with the reindeer bones in the same layer. At Cova del Cedron in Spain, the story repeats. Eifer, Neanderthal child only a few years old, bears the same telltale marks of butchery, the same evidence of marrow extraction. Different cave, same story, as if this behavior was a pattern embedded in the survival strategies of multiple groups across Europe. And yet, it is what comes next that twists the knife deeper. Travel forward to Gough's cave in England, only 14,700 years ago. An eye blink in evolutionary time, and you find the handiwork not of Neanderthals, but of Homo sapiens, our own species. Here, the Magdalenian people didn't just consume flesh. They transformed skulls into drinking vessels, carefully trimming, shaping, and smoothing the bone into bowls. Some bones bore engravings, deliberate zigzag lines carved into human remains, as if decoration and death had fused into one practice. Archaeologists call it nutritional cannibalism, but that label feels almost too clinical, too sterile, for the reality it represents. These were people who had options. The cave is filled with animal remains, horses, deer, birds, enough to feed entire groups, and yet they chose to consume humans anyway. Then spent hours crafting skull cups with the same care they gave to their stone tools. Why? Was it ritual, dominance, a message carved into flesh that survival wasn't the only purpose of these acts? Or was it simpler, a reflection of how fragile the line between resource and reverence truly is? Some researchers argue the answer is as stark as it is uncomfortable. Humans, for a vast stretch of history, simply saw other humans as part of the available landscape of protein. And when competition sharpened, when rival groups pressed too close, when the future of one clan might be threatened by the existence of another, the logic of consumption followed. Kill the rival, eat the rival, use their bones to craft the tools of tomorrow's hunt. If you feel uneasy, you should, because these discoveries force us to confront not monsters, not beasts, but ourselves, species so close to us genetically that Neanderthals interbred with modern humans, leaving traces of their DNA in our blood today. Stay with me, because the most chilling part is not that this behavior existed, but that it was repeated across continents, across millennia, appearing again and again like a shadow that never fully faded. And the deeper we follow this trail, the clearer it becomes that cannibalism wasn't merely an act of desperation, but sometimes a calculated choice, one that reveals a side of humanity most of us would rather pretend never existed. It's tempting to believe that cannibalism was forced by starvation, a desperate act of survival in times of famine. That explanation would let us walk away feeling that our ancestors were innocent, victims of circumstance, but the bones argue otherwise. At Gran Dolina, where children were butchered, the same cave layers contained deer, horses, and cattle, plenty of food. The climate at that time was not an unforgiving ice age, but a relatively mild Mediterranean environment, rich in plants and animals. Yet human bones were processed with the same efficiency as those of prey. In Belgium's Goyet Cave, the Neanderthals who cracked open the skulls of their kin also feasted on reindeer, leaving behind piles of their bones. They weren't starving. At Gough's cave in England, the Magdalenian people not only consumed human flesh, but transformed skulls into polished drinking cups, a process requiring patience, skill, and time to spare. Famine does not leave room for artistry. What this evidence suggests is chilling in its simplicity. Other humans were not forbidden prey. They were part of the menu, sometimes chosen not out of need, but out of strategy. By targeting children, groups may have weakened rivals before they grew strong enough to fight back. By eating enemies, they gained both calories and psychological dominance. This wasn't ritual, it wasn't symbolism, it was practicality, repeated across generations, across continents, across species. And the realization it forces upon us is perhaps more disturbing than any famine story. Cannibalism at times was not an aberration of human behavior, but a tool woven into survival itself. Stay with me, because the final step in this journey will bring us face to face with what these discoveries say about us now, about the fragile line between the humanity we claim and the predator we carry within. For years, archaeologists tried to soften the implications of these discoveries. They leaned on words like ritual, mortuary practice, symbolic behavior, because those terms sound safer than the raw truth. But each new site stripped away the comfort. The bones of Homo antecessor children at Gran Dolina, the butchered Neanderthal at Goyet, the skull cups at Gough's cave, all told the same unflinching story. This was not aberration, it was pattern. And patterns mean something. They reveal a way of seeing the world, a framework where the body of an enemy, a rival, or even a neighbor could be reduced to meat, marrow, and tool. Think about that for a moment. The same intelligence that shaped spears to kill horses also justified carving into a child's ribs. The same imagination that could design a shelter could design a way to drink wine from a human skull. These acts were not mistakes. They were choices. And if they were choices, then they reveal something buried deep in the human condition, the capacity to turn our greatest gift, reason, toward our darkest impulses. Some researchers argue that this brutal calculus may even have given certain groups an advantage. To weaken rivals by consuming their children is to secure resources for your own. To turn bones into tools is to stretch survival further. In this logic, cannibalism was not a breakdown of humanity, but a survival strategy that worked, which forces us into the most unsettling question of all. If it worked for them, what stopped it from continuing? Did morality arise, or simply more efficient weapons, more complex social structures, more organized forms of violence that made cannibalism unnecessary? The bones do not answer, they only sit in their glass cases, silent and stripped, reminding us that the story of humanity is not only firelight and invention, not only art painted on cave walls, but also the crunch of marrow sucked from a child's femur, and the shadow of that truth lingers, waiting to be recognized. In the end, the bones leave us with a truth we can't escape. Cannibalism wasn't only a desperate act of survival, it was sometimes a choice, repeated across species and centuries. Our ancestors hunted animals, but they also hunted each other, carving flesh and marrow with the same precision. It forces us to see humanity not as purely noble, but as capable of brutality as old as fire itself. The same hands that painted caves also split skulls. And maybe that is the darkest truth, that the predator we fear has always been human, and it has always been us.